is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Call the Cabinet. Ask your question now. Call 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Yes, it's 3 minutes after 9 on Monday, April the 4th, and it is Call the Cabinet exclusively here on LBC. We welcome Brexit Opportunities and Government Efficiency Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg in the studio. Just a quick word. Good to have you on board, Minister. I trust you're well. No signs of COVID or anything like that?
I'm extremely well, thank you, and I hope you're well too.
I am. But I've tested every morning. I've got this damn sore throat, but as long as we're well, let's go straight to the calls. First up, Chris in Richmond. Chris, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, sir. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Jacob. Good morning, Nick.
Morning, Chris.
Given the immense sacrifices made by millions during COVID, will you apologise, Jacob, for describing the Partygate scandal as, quotes, fluff?
No, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is try to contextualise that we have a war going on in Ukraine. We have atrocities being carried out. We have pictures coming through that show the enormous brutality of Putin's army. And what I was saying was that in the context of what is going on, not just with Ukraine, but also with the cost of living crisis, this is not the most important issue in the world. Having said that, people should obviously obey the law.
Chris.
Well, number one, we know that Boris Johnson has clearly misled lots of people by saying that there were no
No,
parties.
you don't.
And then it was well, hang on. He has said that the rules were followed at all times, which last week's revelation of 20 fixed penalty notices would rather suggest that was incorrect.
The fact that the Prime Minister was given wrong information doesn't mean he misled people.
So, Chris, I'll come back. So the Prime Minister was given wrong information. Is that the situation?
Well, the Prime Minister said that he was told that the rules were followed, but that turns out not to be correct, and we know that fines have now been issued. But the Prime Minister can only work on the information he's given.
So it was the information that was incorrect, not the Prime Minister?
If the Prime Minister is told information that is incorrect and passes that information on, he has made no deliberate effort to mislead anybody.
You don't for 1 second countenance the idea he's attempted to mislead Parliament, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
No, I don't.
OK, back to Chris. Chris?
Well, I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous sycophancy because you owe the guy a job in the Cabinet, the Cabinet job you have. One of my relatives, Jacob, last year had a stroke. I had to wait 4 hours outside accident emergency. Other people I saw were alone with chest pains in all sorts of terrible conditions. Yet the Prime Minister and other people were having quizzes, parties, cheese and wine parties, while other people did what they were supposed to do. I mean, you insult the intelligence of the British people with your remarks, Jacob.
I don't think that's right. Obviously, COVID was a terribly difficult time for people, and people died unaccompanied, and that is the saddest thing. And the picture of the Queen at Prince Philip's funeral will, I think, remain in all our minds. So, of course, people should have obeyed the rules.
But they didn't within number 10.
And some people didn't, and we now know that some fines have been issued.
But
I would reiterate that is not as significant as what is going on in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis.
But for someone such as Chris, respectfully, Mr. Rees-Mogg, and for some of my listeners who bade farewell to their loved ones as they got in ambulances, never to see them again, who went to hospital wards and were not permitted on there due to COVID, to hear that at that very time there were parties going on with them.
They are understandably cross about this.
It's a visceral feeling.
They are understandably cross about this.
Which they don't see, Mr. Rees-Mogg, as, quotes, fluff or, quotes, fundamentally trivial.
But I think we have to think about, in the inquiry, whether this level of rule was right. We need to get to what was the fundamental issue.
But that doesn't help someone saying goodbye to Grandad.
I agree with that. But what we should learn from this is not in relation to parties, but was it ever right to say that you weren't allowed to be with people as they were dying? And I think it's so important that the inquiry that is going to take place looks into whether the restrictions were proportionate, because actually I think that you remember the picture from a funeral where an official came along and said that I think it was a son shouldn't be near.
The son was taken from his mum.
Yes. This was not something that should ever have happened, in my view. That element of rule enforcement, of approach to rules, was simply unkind and inhuman.
But you're almost arguing against yourself, because if that son and that widow encountered that level of grief, to hear a senior politician describe it, quote, as fluff and fundamentally trivial, that's sickening to them, Mr. Rees-Mogg. I ask you once again to review those words.
No, I think those words, in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, are completely reasonable. I don't think... I don't think the issue of what may or may not have happened in Downing Street and what we are now finding out is fundamental. What I think is fundamental is that we look in the inquiry at how the rules were devised and the effect that they had, because I think some of those rules were inhuman.
Chris, thanks for your call. Sympathies for your loss. Robin in Newlyn and Cornwall. Robin, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Hello, Robin.
Now, given that the fresh, live fish and shellfish export industries have greatly suffered through the additional red tape and expenses encumbering them post-Brexit, do you believe, A, it is acceptable to leave these industries deal with these huge encumbrances on their own? B, do you think it is advisable that the UK fisheries trade deficit should continue on its current downward spiral? And C, can I please discuss your answers with you on air?
Stand by.
Well, you
Mr.
are discussing...
That last one was addressed to me, I think.
I see, yes, you are discussing on air. So, Robin, thank you for calling in. The issue here is, of course, that the rules that the EU applies on the UK are not under our control. So they have a freedom to apply rules to us, and we do to them. But we obviously want to support the fishing industry and support it by the fact that it has new independence and that independence will grow because there is a temporary scheme to allow continued foreign fishing, but that will end eventually. And so it's about ensuring that the British fisherman is able to get to the best stocks in UK territorial waters. And ultimately, if the EU or member states of the EU want to import these goods, they will need to make it reasonable to do so. And they have made some ameliorations to their rules since we finally left, because they actually want to buy these goods. And so it becomes market forces that determine what the level of regulation becomes. But initially, we have to remember the EU was very cross that we'd left, and they wanted to make life as difficult as possible.
Robin, how long have you been in the fishing industry, sir?
I've been in the fishing industry 50 years.
Can I ask you, since Brexit, has it got better? Has it got worse? Was it roughly where it was before, and why?
Well, basically, I disagree with Jacob's summary of that, because basically EU regulations and laws have been in place for over 2 decades, which includes any third country, which we have now become since we've left the EU. These rules and regulations are to guarantee food security and food standards. The standards that they hold are still the same as before Brexit. The standards that we hold now have had to change because basically, A, we have polluted waters, which the government voted to continue putting more sewage into our inland seas and estuaries. This has grossly affected the water quality. We now have 90% of British waters are classified B, not A, which means they have to be depurated before they can be sent abroad, and it causes immense problems on paperwork.
Will you accept as someone a lifetime in the industry? He's saying it's not as good as it was. Brexit has made it worse. Jacob Rees-Mogg, why is he wrong and you're right?
No, what I am saying, what I'm going to say, is that the EU regulations have always been a form of protectionism, that the UK industry is not fundamentally less safe than it was before we left the European Union. The water quality is designated on the same basis as it was before we left the European Union. Actually, the Environment Act tightened up the rules on what water companies could do. So they've got stricter rather than laxer since we left the European Union. But the EU uses non-tariff barriers as a means of protecting domestic markets, and that's what it's always done. That was one of the problems with the EU, because it forces prices up for consumers.
So finally, you're saying the British fishing industry is healthier as a result of Brexit than it was a number of years ago, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
What I'm saying is that the standards applied in food production in this country have not deteriorated since we left the European Union.
But is the fishing industry healthier?
And water quality is actually improving, and those regulations were tightened in the Environment Act. But I absolutely accept Robin's point that the EU is applying non-tariff barriers to make life difficult for British fishermen, but that is because of the doctrine of the European Union. It is not because of the doctrine of the UK government.
So it is tougher to be a fisherman or fisherwoman as a result of the EU's activities?
Hold on, it depends entirely on the circumstances and which market you're dealing with, because some of our own waters we now have more access to,
Right.
But there are some barriers, non-tariff barriers to trade that the EU has imposed.
Robin, safe fishing, thank you. Brenda's in St Ives. Brenda, you're on the radio. Good morning, Brenda.
Good morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Brenda.
Hello.
Good morning. We were told if we exited the EU, we would have lower energy prices, cut in VAT and cheaper food. You lied to us, and in the times that we're in, why hasn't this happened?
Well, what we said was that it would be possible to change VAT on energy, and actually, in the budget, the Chancellor cut VAT on means of saving energy, so insulation and so on, which was something we could not do within the EU. What I argued about food is that we have tariffs on food coming from
food, clothing and footwear.
That's right.
Cheaper
That's
food,
absolutely right.
Clothing
absolutely
and
right.
footwear.
Because we have tariffs on food, clothing and footwear.
Food price inflation up 4.3% last month. Do go on, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Yes. But these
That's
are
not cheaper.
These are two different things. That one is the costs that we impose on countries we import from. And with the trade deals that we are doing, and particularly important with Australia and New Zealand, we are taking tariffs off food, footwear and clothing. And the more free trade deals we do, the more tariffs will be removed. And more importantly, actually, because they have a big cost in terms of the flexibility of markets, the more non-tariff barriers will be removed. But there is a global inflation in food prices which has nothing to do with Brexit. So the fact that the wheat price has gone up because partly the invasion of Ukraine by Putin's forces is not something that I was speculating on in the run-up to Brexit. I was talking about the costs we impose as a nation, and these are tariff and non-tariff barriers which are being removed as we make more free trade deals, and that is fundamentally important, and that, in a cost of living crisis, becomes even more important because it helps ameliorate the cost of living crisis that we are suffering from.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Brenda. You referenced the spring statement a moment ago. Many people are saying more help should have been provided. VAT should be cut on energies. The Green Levy needs to be reviewed. Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, look, these are obviously matters for the Chancellor.
But you'll have a view.
But I'll tell you, there is one thing you have to bear in mind, that if you want to control the cost of living crisis, you have to keep government expenditure under control. We know from the 60s and 70s that if you think spending your way out of inflation is the answer, it's simply wrong. It makes the inflation worse. So the Chancellor faces the difficult balancing act of ensuring that the public finances are kept in order whilst also helping people as much as possible. But anyone who says to you the way to help people is by increasing government spending is wrong and would lead to higher inflation, because inflation is partly the question of too much money supplying too few goods.
Giving people that £20 a week temporary uplift that was taken away last year, that could be a lifesaver, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
What the government has done instead, as you know, is reduced the taper rate on universal credit and increased the living wage so that people in work
but many of these
getting
folk
are
not in work, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, we have the highest level of payroll employment that we've ever had. Unemployment is back down to levels pre-pandemic.
But if I'm not in work...
So, well, the whole strategy is to ensure that people get out of poverty through getting into work, and therefore having schemes...
Maybe I've got emotional health issues. I can't work.
Having schemes to help people, well, then that's a different set of benefits. They're disability benefits.
Why can't I have the 20 quid back?
And personal independence payments that are available. But people on universal credit, we want to try and help get into work, because then they are better off. The route out of poverty is getting people into work. That is fundamental.
Those who can.
But there's a different set of benefits for people with disabilities. And we spend more on disability benefits proportionately than almost any other country in the world, and rightly so.
Brenda, I'm sorry, do you want to come back to Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Yes, I do. You cut VAT on solar panels. How is that going to help the ordinary struggling person who can't afford to pay their bills? You are so patronising, Mr. Rees-Mogg, and I find it absolutely outrageous that people are going to suffer from hypothermia, they're going to die, they can't eat and they can't heat their homes. So how is that helping the ordinary struggling person?
And I also have to put you, Mr. Rees-Mogg, you're part of a government that's put up taxes to the highest level since the late 1940s, which, knowing you and have read about you, I wouldn't think sticks well with you and your background.
Well, the next highest level is under Margaret Thatcher. And you would ask why, and the question is, how do you maintain the public finances? It is fundamentally important to maintain the public finances. Now, £400 billion plus was spent on dealing with COVID and keeping businesses open. And this was the right thing to do, because the inflation that we have currently got would have been much worse if businesses had closed during the pandemic. You're seeing this actually with British Airways today. It's very interesting. Why are the prices of European flights up until Easter Monday so high? It's because of a shortage of supply. Why is that? Because people left the industry during the pandemic. If you don't maintain the structures of the economy, then inflation gets very rapid because you don't have the supply that is necessary to meet the demand. So that 400 billion was money that had to be spent to maintain the structures of the economy. But we have to ensure that we live within our means. If we don't, the cost of living crisis will get worse. This is not ideological. It is not saying that a balanced budget is the right thing in principle. It is saying that if you add to public expenditure during cost of living crisis, you put prices up more.
But you do accept that as regards food banks, which I think you once described as rather uplifting.
Well, hold on. It was on your show.
It was, yes.
And what I said,
do as much as I can to lay the traps.
What I said, as you perfectly well know, because you pay close attention to your own programme, was that people who donate to and run them. I was talking about them. I wasn't talking about the need for them, as anyone who listened knew, and the odd socialist tried to pretend that I'd said something different.
But you are aware people are choosing their food at food banks that does not need heating because they cannot afford the gas to warm the food.
I'm not beginning to say that the cost of living crisis isn't affecting people seriously.
But don't we need to review the budget, the spring statement?
I think what we actually need is to make the economy more efficient. We need the supply side reforms that take obstacles out of this country. We need to be thinking about extracting every last cubic inch of gas from the North Sea because we want security of supply. But 2050 is a long time off. We're not trying to become net zero tomorrow, and we are going to need fossil fuels in the interim, and we should use ours that we have got available. And these are supply side reforms, these are regulatory reforms that allow things to happen and to happen quickly.
And are you in favour of going nuclear and looking at wind as well?
I'm very much in favour of going nuclear. I'm very interested by the modular nuclear reactors. I mean, as I understand it, in very simple terms, it's like taking the nuclear reactor you have in a submarine and allowing that to power a town. I think this approach may be very cost-effective, and Rolls-Royce is doing very good work on this.
Onshore, offshore?
Well, offshore wind is providing an increasing part of our supply, and that is important. But you don't always know where the wind is going to blow. That is the problem. Whereas nuclear provides base load.
And fracking, lastly, before we move on? Are you a fan of fracking?
Well, I understand there's being a review of it. I think I read this in the paper at the weekend. I was very impressed by the report in 2012 by the Royal Society and the Royal Geographic Society that pointed out that the seismic effect from fracking was equivalent to, if not slightly less than, a rockfall in a disused coal mine. So I think one needs proportionality about the seismic issues. But if we're sitting on tons of gas, that seems quite an interesting opportunity.
Kevin's in Wimbledon. Your question to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Kevin, go ahead.
Good morning. Morning, Jacob.
Morning, Kevin.
My question is, in terms of the Brexit priorities, what are the top 3 Brexit priorities you're currently working on, and how do you foresee and propose that they will improve my life?
Okay. Well, the 2 things that I'm doing most directly are a procurement bill and a retained EU law bill. The procurement bill, to give you an example, will reduce the number of times somebody wishing to supply the government has to put in their basic details from 70 times to 1 time. Now, this becomes a big saving for business. It makes it easier for small and medium-sized enterprises to get involved, who are, of course, the beating heart of our economy. The retained EU law bill is a proposed bill that will make it easier to reform and remove EU legislation that makes us less efficient. So those are 2 big things that I will be dealing with in the coming months. But there are lots of things we've done already. So the announcement on Solvency II for insurers potentially brings tens of billions of pounds into the economy by freeing up the rules on insurance, which were never suitable for the UK economy, never fully imposed in Germany, as it happens, just incidentally, and free up money to go into potentially more interesting investments, more venture capital, more help again for small businesses. You saw the amazing work that Grant Shapps did with the HGV issue, where he got rid of over 30 pettifogging rules that made it harder for us to get HGV licenses issued, most of which were EU-related. Not all. Some of them were our own self-imposed ones. So things are already happening that we are doing, and we've got more to come. And it's all about making this economy more efficient and more competitive, and that will help deal with the cost of living crisis.
All right, let's come to some of the text, tweets and emails. Norman in Oadby. Does Jacob Rees-Mogg agree there should be a windfall tax, as Labour is suggesting, on the big power companies?
No, I don't.
Why not, sir?
Why not? Bear in mind that 2 years ago, during the low point of economic demand during COVID, the oil price was actually below zero. And you need oil companies that will invest for the long term, because if we're going to have...
But they don't know what to do with the profits.
Well,
You have Bernard Looney of BP saying, we don't know what to do with the money. Well, can I suggest, on this instance, the government knows what to do, because it would save all of our listeners and your constituents between £600 and £700 each on their power bills.
Well, bear in mind, the oil companies already pay tens of billions of pounds in tax every year.
But this is additional.
Hold on.
Go ahead.
They pay this tax, which goes into general public expenditure. We want to get oil out of the North Sea. We want to get more gas out of the North Sea. If we're going to do this, they need money to invest. And the oil companies make very low profits at some points and high profits at others. There is a clear cycle. Now, if you say...
They've got all their money they need to R&D now. This is unexpected. Hence, I don't need to tell you the meaning of a word. Windfall. This is money they never knew was coming.
No, I don't think that's the right way of characterising it. I think this is just part of the economic cycle. And if the government takes away their profits, bear in mind they are very heavily taxed already, then they will invest on a basis where they don't get these profits in future, which will make the marginal new well less attractive. So they will pull out of the investment. Every investment
so if we tax them, they won't look for non-fossil fuel. Is that what you're saying?
No, they won't necessarily even look for the existing fossil fuels. So what do you want? Do you want to secure a long-term...
I don't want people unable to heat their homes.
No, quite. So what's the best way to do that? Is to increase supply. And that is going to be a variety of supplies. But to increase supply, you need people who are going to invest in it. Who are the best people to invest in it? The people who actually know about it. And they will do that by investing the money that they have. They will also pay some of the money out to dividends which goes to pensioners across the country. Bear in mind, BP is owned to a significant extent by UK pension funds. So that's money that will be going to many of your listeners.
Jane's in Haringey. Jane, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning. I have what should be a very, very simple question. What is a woman, and can a woman have a penis?
Well, I think, as often, the Bible gives the best answer to this. Genesis 1:27, God made man in his own image, he made man and he made woman, he made both of them. I think God making us in his own image is quite good enough for me. And your second question, I think the answer is no.
Jane?
Quite frankly, I'm really mortified because Jacob Rees-Mogg represents everything that I loathe. But if the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and the Greens don't wake up, smell our fury and respect my sex, we're going to have a Tory government for the foreseeable future. I always vote. I cannot and I will not vote for any politician who expects me to suspend belief and does not respect my sex.
Well, you're almost on the same page as Mr. Rees-Mogg then, Jane, because
I know. We live in bizarre times, but, we're meant to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast at the moment.
Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, at least Jen didn't say we're meant to believe 6 impossible things before Brexit, because people often confuse breakfast and Brexit. Right. I've done it myself in speeches. I think the issue is, I think, a complex one, because there are issues of tolerance and there are issues of kindliness. And I think it's very important to allow people to make whatever choices in their life.
You can accept someone can be born within the wrong body, for want of a better...
And people must be allowed to lead the lives they want. I don't want to tell them how to lead their lives. But I agree with Jane, there are some things that are perfectly obvious, and you can't contradict them.
But when it comes to a swimmer who was born a man but wants to now compete as a woman, or a cyclist, I hate to say their own games, but is their own games the best way forward?
I think I'm going to appeal to the Daily Telegraph, who had the best April Fool of anybody, who said that considering how poorly they'd done over the winter, the men's cricket team was going to be replaced by the women's cricket team, who've done rather better.
They did.
And that might solve all of these problems when the English women's cricket team take on the New Zealanders at Lord's in May.
Commiserations to the England women's team, who put up a fine
I
fight
know.
against the Aussies, but they're pretty dominant, aren't they, Australian women at the moment in that sport?
Well, and the Australian men.
And the Australian men, for that matter. You're right. Jane, thank you for your call. Elsa in Wandsworth, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Elsa, go ahead. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. So I have to give a very short description as to why I'm going to ask the following question. A few weeks ago, the government, Boris Johnson, I would say, stood in Parliament and said that there would be a scheme that would allow us, British people, to open our homes with the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which I, along with 140,000 people, supposedly signed up for. The process has been excruciating, for lack of a better word. I have found somebody to sponsor. It's a young woman who is currently in Western Ukraine. I found her through Facebook because there is no legal government way to match me with someone. So I have found her through Facebook. We have done the entire application process as is required.
Can I move you to your question? I've got to move you to your question because I know you speak for about 150,000 families.
Exactly. 18 days we have been waiting since we applied, and the whole thing is plagued with inefficiency. So my question to you, sir, is it that this government is completely inefficient, or is it that it's simply xenophobic?
Ooh. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
No, neither of those. That, as I understand it, 25,000 visas have so far been issued.
1,500 Ukrainians have made it to the country, though.
Yes.
Shockingly low compared to some of our European neighbours.
But as I say, 25,000 visas have been issued, and once the visas have been issued...
Visas aren't required elsewhere.
No, I understand that.
Why is the UK the only country, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
The reason we're requiring visas, but bear in mind, the visas are being issued and the biometric tests are being done once people get to the United Kingdom. There are issues around security. There are concerns about people trafficking.
Well, surely the French would have concerns, but they're happy to welcome people, the Italians, the Belgians, the Germans.
We're not part of the Schengen system, so we are part of a different system. Once you're in the EU, you can travel quite freely within it, as you know, and therefore separate countries can't have their own security protections. So we are building in some protections to ensure the safety of the country, that we don't encourage or help or aid people trafficking, which I think is really important. And I'm sure you've read some of the stories
horrific
about that, and that's really worrying. So when you say the EU hasn't got controls, perhaps it might actually help people if they did. So that
how would it help a woman stuck in Ukraine or wherever she
you want to get people
Germany
over the border securely, and you want processes that help them move. And I'm sure you read that story about some man offering a lift to a woman, and then the woman got suspicious and the hotel authorities help her. That you need to protect people and you need to act swiftly, and sometimes the protection and the swiftness are in a competition with each other.
But your government efficiency minister, I have to put it to you, this is anything but efficient.
It is becoming more efficient.
It's not efficient now,
It's
is it,
becoming more efficient, and the numbers are increasing every day. The processing is being sped up. The process has been simplified. The biometric tests that were going to take place before people came.
But it's not efficient currently, is it?
Well, issuing 25,000 visas is a good start. There is more to be done. Of course there's more to be done.
Have you been asked whether you're going to be taking any Ukrainian refugees? Every other politician seems to have been asked.
I have. It is something that I think everyone in the country is considering, and I admire those greatly who have already worked out how they could do it, but I don't want to promise to do something that I haven't done.
So you are still actively considering it?
I'm considering it.
OK, a couple of last questions. This one from Joyce in Kent. If Boris Johnson were to be fined over Partygate, should he quit?
Well, I'm not going to answer hypothetical questions.
But
I'm not going to answer hypothetical questions.
There's no way I can get into that. And really,
no, I'm not going
to any other way. OK,
no.
fine. We've talked a lot about economising. What are you doing to economise in the Rees-Mogg household?
I'm not going to begin to pretend that my situation is a typical situation. I'm in a very fortunate situation. My concern on the cost of living crisis is much more for my constituents who are contacting me, who are finding life difficult, who are coming to see me in my constituency surgeries, who are finding life difficult, and what can be done to help the people.
But what do you do when they say, Mr. Rees-Mogg, I'm having to get apples because I can't heat up the pasta, or whatever it might be?
What can be done to help people? What can be done to help people to make sure they're claiming the right benefits that they're entitled to? It can be simple things like that. Try and help people in these very difficult circumstances. But I think I would look absurd if I said it was my own personal circumstances that were relevant to this.
But you can say with a straight face there is help out there for people. You're confident that the government of which you are a prominent member is providing help where it is required.
There is help, but it is difficult. It is very difficult. One of the things that's often discussed in these contexts is the price of milk. And
You've seen the Daily Telegraph
I
today.
represent a dairying constituency. And so let's talk about the farm gate price of milk. Because, whilst I've been an MP and a candidate before, the price of milk has varied between farm gate, 20p to 30p a litre. 20p they've been losing money and finding it very difficult, and dairy farms have been going out. 30p they've been making a small amount. Input costs have gone up. Fertiliser costs have gone up, feed prices have gone up. And the last figure I've seen, I'm so surprised by that I'm cautious even to say it, because it is now 54p at a farm gate price. Now, that is an extraordinary increase from where it's been.
What's he or she getting from the supermarkets?
That is what is being paid to the farmer.
I see, I'm so
up
sorry.
from the 20 to 30p
My God.
range. So
that's virtually, almost 100%.
Now, last October it was up to about 30p, which was the sort of higher end of the range that we've been working within for the last 10, 15 years, and it's now up at 54p, and that feeds through to supermarkets. So there is a real cost of living crisis that is coming from the farm gate all the way through. Governments can't control prices. We tried price and incomes policies in the 70s, and they were absolute failure. What is needed? Obviously, the Bank of England is responding, but that's difficult because monetary responses, tightening monetary conditions is hard for people, and the government has to keep spending under control whilst trying to target help where it's most needed. But I think that issue with the price of milk that is being paid to the farmer, so the input price for all consumers, is really fundamental to understanding how serious this is.
Lastly, I can't let you go. You talk about serious matters, Ukraine. You and I are having this conversation after now. We're having first-hand accounts from British and other Western journalists about people being having their hands tied and shot, women being raped, subjugation really, rape being used as subjugation, bodies being left as booby traps. Jacob Rees-Mogg, more sanctions, more direct action, military action?
Well, look, this is sheer evil of a kind that we did not think we would see in our lifetimes, I think. The government has been increasing the sanctions, has been ratcheting things up. It has been supporting Ukraine with weaponry. This is clearly the right thing to do, and I think we are all full of admiration for the people of Ukraine, for the courage that they have shown and the determination, and the president, who, like Churchill, has given the lion's roar for a lion-hearted people.
But they say, could we stop all of us, the whole of the West, buying Russian oil worth $1 billion a day?
Absolutely.
Would you agree we should switch off all need for Russian oil?
This is why we need to go back to our earlier conversation, allowing the oil companies to invest so they get every last drop out of the North Sea.
And lastly, a word towards your neighbouring, a word of support to your neighbouring Conservative MP, David Warburton, who I'm sure you know well. His constituents, I think, borders yours. He's faced with a few issues at this time.
Look, a few important questions. As leader of the House, I was closely involved with the ICGS, the complaints grievance system that helps people who have complaints to make. And I think it's really important that people who are worried about their working relationship in Parliament have an independent body that they can go to, that can do its work. Sir Stephen Irwin, who is a High Court judge, very distinguished figure, independent of Parliament, is able to look at these things. But it'd be absolutely wrong of me to say where I think these things are going.
But just a word of comfort to a neighbouring MP.
I obviously feel sorry for somebody on a personal level, but it's really important that the inquiry is carried out and people feel safe working in Parliament. So there are always there's a need for personal sympathy, but there's also a need for a proper process to be followed.
Jacob Rees-Mogg is Minister for State and Brexit Opportunities and Government Efficiency, appearing here exclusively on Call the Cabinet on LBC, where the news is next.
Speaking to LBC, Jacob Rees-Mogg has refused to apologise for describing Partygate as trivial fluff. The government minister says it's not the most important issue compared with the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis. He also appeared to blame the COVID rules in place at the time, calling them inhuman. Ukraine's President Zelensky has accused Russian forces of genocide in his country. Officials have reported massacres of civilians in towns near Kiev, discovered following the withdrawal of Russian troops. 9 new signs of illness have been added to the official NHS list of COVID